Discretionary listener participation is advised for the following pro wrestling podcast.
If I leave here tomorrow, would you still remember to listen to the Stick to Wrestling podcast? I want to thank my friends at Leonard Skinner for writing that song about their favorite podcast, Stick to Wrestling. It is the only wicked good wrestling podcast out there. It is the People's Podcast. It is a major league of professional wrestling podcast. I'm John McAdam. Welcome again to Stick to Wrestling. Little business to get out of the way before we get started. I encourage you wholeheartedly, if you listen to this show, sign up for our Facebook page. We got a lot. We're still getting a lot of really good commentary about our last show with the interview with Ole Anderson and Dave Meltzer. We actually had an NBA basketball thread pop out of nowhere, which is pretty cool. And if you like this show, you want to hear me on Twitter, follow me on Twitter. Just search John McAdam and follow the guys who are fighting with chairs. Now, I haven't done this in like a year and a half. And I'm going to start doing it about once a month. It's called Mooching for Money. I do this podcast for free. And if you would like to contribute to the podcast, like show a little appreciation, PayPal me. My email address is prowrestlingarchives, that's all one word, @gmail.com. So hopefully the money will come pouring in like it didn't do last time, but that's okay. And if you cannot or just don't want to contribute to the show, I still thank you for listening. And with that, I want to bring on a new guest. The King of Baltimore, as far as I'm concerned, King of Baltimore Wrestling, John Feld. John, thank you for taking the time.
No, thank you, John. I appreciate you having me on your show.
I came up with the idea to have you on a long time ago, and we are long overdue. John, tell me now, like I said, you're like the Baltimore guy the way I'm kind of the Boston guy. Tell me when you first started watching wrestling.
I started watching wrestling in the early 80s. My father was a big wrestling fan. He loved Bruno and the WWF, and he used to go to the Coliseum and everything. So I watched it with him. We would watch Georgia Championship Wrestling when we visited my uncle in the county because we didn't have cable in the city. So when we went out there, we would watch that. But for me as a fan, it kind of started in late 85. My cousin Steve moved across the street and, our fandom just took off. And then, of course, the glory years of 1986 and 87 was really when we just, we were all over it, renting videotapes from Errol's Video and buying the wrestling magazines every month. But yeah, probably 85 was really when my fandom took off for wrestling.
Okay, wow. Yeah. And now tell us about the first card you ever attended. Like, how long had you been a fan and what was the show?
The first card I went to was for my 12th birthday. It was May 17th, 1986. It was an NWA card. The headline that night was Dusty and the Road Warriors against Ivan and Nikita Koloff and Baron Von Raschke in a cage for the 6-man tag title. Dusty and the Road Warriors won. That was my first card. So that place went crazy. I'd never heard anything that loud in my life. The Midnight Express also wrestled the Rock and Roll Express, and Jim was in a cage during that match. And Magnum wrestled Tully. Tully was the national champion. Magnum was the U.S. champion. But yeah, that was my first card. It was for my 12th birthday.
That is really cool. I like that. Now, we talk about this sometimes on the show. In the WWF, I mean, on TV, they made the cage matches sound like they were just insane. It was, it was something straight out of the Roman Coliseum. And I remember seeing my first cage match and just being like, this sucks. And the cage was nowhere near as big as they promised it would be. It was Tony Atlas and Jesse the Body Ventura in Boston. And like I said, the whole thing was just, a huge disappointment. Were you like, but you were a lot younger than me. Like, were you happy with the cage expectation, or what was it like for you?
I think I was just in awe. I mean, you walk in and you see that NWA banner along the side of the ring, know, and it was just, I'd never seen it before. So it was almost like when you walk into a ballpark and you see the field for the first time in a new stadium. That's the way it was when I walked out and I saw the ring. When we walked and got to our seats, and we were kind of up, so we were looking down on the ring. We had great spot, but it was magic. It was just, that, like you say, it's funny though, the ring doesn't look as big in person as you would think it would be, but yeah, it was magical. When I went, every time I went to wrestling, it was just magical. And the thing is that in the years that we went, which was basically 86 through 87, we never went to an WWF show.
Oh, wow.
We only went to NWA.
Did you watch the WWF on TV?
Absolutely.
Oh, wow.
Did.
And
yeah,
you just said, these guys are not for me. I'm going to the NWA shows and that's it.
It's funny. The WWF for me in the 80s, looking back at it now, was almost like a toy store. You know what I mean? You had the larger-than-life characters. We got the LJN dolls, and I had the ring and everything. But, the NWA, for me now, is what sticks out. You know what I mean? I remember the angles. I remember the wrestlers. And even the wrestlers in the WWF that I was drawn to were guys that came through Crockett and the AWA, and of course, Bret Hart coming through Calgary and everything. So we were just more drawn to the NWA. I mean, we watched both. I watched Saturday Night's Main Event. I was, 13 when Hogan wrestled Andre at WrestleMania 3. So I was so nervous. I didn't know until the next day if Hogan had won or not. But yeah, we just seemed to stick with NWA, which is odd because my wife, her parents went to the WWF. They never went to NWA. They only went to WWF shows. So it was kind of wild.
Now, let's talk about this. Your wife's family, or the women in your wife's family, really got pissed at Roddy Piper for a promo he specifically cut on the women of Baltimore. What did he say?
It was on a Saturday morning. My wife was watching it with her father and her grandfather. And Piper came out and started cutting a promo saying that, women in Baltimore were pigs and they were ugly and they were fat and just saying what he could about women being so terrible. And Marilyn and my wife looked at her father and she was like, "Is that the show we're going to?" And he was like, "Yeah, it is. That's the one we're going to." And her mom from the other room was like, I hope he gets his ass kicked. So that night he wrestled Hogan. She got to see Hogan and Piper wrestle.
That is pretty amazing that on her first show, she got to see arguably two of the three biggest stars of the 80s go at it.
Yeah, she kind of enjoyed it. She liked Ricky Steamboat. Her favorite actually was Tito Santana. So, I was kind of picking her brain before, coming on the show, finding like the things that they did. And, like her grandfather, he bought tickets every single month for the WWF and just went. It was like basically church for him. He went every single month to see the WWF.
Now, when did he start and when did he stop?
He actually started in the 40s.
Man.
He was actually going to be an amateur boxer. I know this is kind of off subject for wrestling, but
no, it's okay.
He went to the Coliseum, which the Baltimore Coliseum kind of predated the Civic Center. And he was actually going to be an amateur boxer. And he went down there one night with his gloves and all of his gear and everything, and he was getting ready to fight, and his father showed up and grabbed him by the ear and told him, "You're not boxing," and grabbed him out of there and yanked him out. He never got to box in the Coliseum, but he started watching wrestling back then and went all the way up through the 80s.
Wow. And your dad was a fan too. Did you go to those matches with your grandfather ever?
No. The first card, like I said, was with my dad. My father went to see the WWF a lot in the 70s with him being a huge Bruno fan. Unfortunately, he was not in Baltimore the night that, Graham beat San Martino.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, he didn't go to that card. He wasn't there that night.
That would be
right.
That would be quite the painful memory for me if something historic happened in Boston, like the one time something that was a big deal happened in Boston. I missed it.
Oh, it would have broke his heart. I mean, as much as he loved Bruno, I mean, he probably would have been crying as he was walking out there. But yeah, he missed that one.
Oh man, that's too bad. But yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about the shows you went to. Like it sounds like before they had the Tito Santana versus Greg Valentine title switch in Baltimore, but you weren't watching then either, right?
No, wasn't that 84 when Santana beat Valentine, or was that 85?
Let me see. Valentine beat Santana in 84, and then 85. The title switched back in Baltimore. Gotcha. I just remember being like, wow, the title is no longer just changing. either on TV at Madison Square Garden or occasionally at the Philadelphia Civic Center.
Yeah. You got to figure what every title change up to the San Martino loss to Graham was what at the Garden, right?
I think one of them was at Philadelphia. I think Pedro Morales lost the title to Stasiak in Philadelphia. But other than that, yeah, it was strictly New York.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, it was an odd thing for something to happen in Baltimore. I don't know if maybe Baltimore had just started to pick up and everything. I mean, you go back into the 50s and 60s with Baltimore, and the wrestling tradition is pretty rich. I mean, we had a lot of legends come through the city, back in the 20s and the 30s. I mean, a Jim Lundas card drew what would be today a $474,000 house in the 1930s. So, everybody came through Baltimore, whether it was Giant Baba or one of the things. I have a couple programs from the 50s, and one program has Lou Thez as world champion, and one program has Carpentier as champion. So, Ed Contos, the promoter, basically brought in who he needed to bring in. I mean, Antonino Rocca, sorry about that. He had a 7-year win streak in Baltimore from 1955 to 1962.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and, Buddy Rogers wrestled here under his real name. Mildred Burke, the Kangaroos, the Grahams, Johnny Valentine. Stanislaus Zabisco was actually in the first match in 1922 in Baltimore that was sanctioned by the Boxing Commission. So, it goes back pretty far. I mean, even if we found earlier that there was a card or a variety show in the 1840s that listed a wrestling, and it was part of a variety show. It was one of the earliest that we found being in Baltimore.
1840s. Wow.
Yep, 1844.
Now, that's crazy. Now, let me ask you this. You have apparently a very sad story about Road Warrior Animal at the Marriott. I've got to hear this.
Okay, so we left the show that night. It was with my cousin Steve and my cousin Carl, and we were walking to the bus stop. And we're walking by, and Animal is standing in the lobby. And, I'm 12, he's 14, we're little kids. He looks like just a giant. So we, sheepishly walk into the lobby. He's standing, he's signing some, some autographs and everything. We get right up to him. He looks at us. He goes, "No more autographs." And we're like, "Well, please, we love you. We think you guys are the best," and blah, blah. He's like, "No more autographs." And we're like, "Oh, come on." He's like, "Leave me alone." And we're like, okay. At that point, we just turned around and walked away. But it was like, man, you get that close to Road Warrior Animal and he tells you no. Breaking a 12-year-old's heart. It killed me.
And he was signing autographs for the guys before you guys got there. That's the part that really sucks.
Of course, the two people in front of us were two women, so I'm sure he didn't mind signing their autographs.
Okay, I get it now.
Exactly.
And I'll tell you, even out of any context, as soon as someone says the Marriott, I mean, a smile breaks out at my face because, I have seen the what goes on what went on at the Marriott in Philadelphia and Baltimore back in the day.
What? How many promos did Flair cut on the Marriott?
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
He wanted to make sure that if you were a female and you were looking for Ric Flair, you knew where to find him.
Yep. The Marriott after the show. Yep. It was all the time.
And of course, like we would go and hang out with whoever we could hang out with, which, sometimes that worked out pretty well and sometimes it didn't. What can I say?
Yeah. I always wanted to, but we were, with us being kids, I mean, I went in 86 and we went quite a bit in 87, but 1987 was the last time I went to a major promotions card. We had moved from the city. I moved away from my cousin. And, I met my future wife and, I still followed wrestling, and everything, but never went back. And last year was the first time I had been to some independent shows, but I went to the AEW card. I think it was Full Gear last year. And just to kind of see what it was like. And, I enjoyed it. I mean, some of the wrestling's not for me, but it was pretty cool to see the Rock and Roll Express come in and, Ricky Morton do that Canadian driver thing that he does or whatever. But that was pretty cool. But yeah, we always like talked about maybe going to Sabatino's and seeing if we can find the wrestlers down there and see if we can get their autographs and everything. But never happened. But, what do you do? When you're 12 and 13, you're probably not going to get a Sabatino's anyway.
No, I know what you're saying. So let me ask you this. You went in 86 and 87, and did you, you stopped going? Did you stop being a fan, or what happened?
No, it was just a matter of, when my dad had taken me in May of 86, he took us to a show. A neighbor of ours had gotten front row seats to the NWA. And that show was great because it was a barbed wire. The main event was a barbed wire match between Tully and McAdam. So that was great. And, and I'm sure we'll talk about the Crockett Cup, but I went with my cousins. My dad, really didn't go. And then once we moved away from the city and I moved away from my cousin, it just didn't go back. And I stayed a fan. I bought the wrestling magazines every month. I still watched wrestling. It was probably, though, around late 88 or so that I kind of stopped watching, but still bought the magazines. I knew in 89 of, the Steamboat and Flair trilogy. And, of course, the Wrestlemania with Savage and Hogan and everything. And, we watched, like I said, the main event in that February when Andre beat Hogan. So it was just a matter of just never really having the opportunity or really anybody to go with me again.
I understand. So where'd you move to?
We only moved about 10 miles from where we lived before, and from the inner city to a county. And then we were there for a few years. And then I lived in West Virginia for a couple of years. And, I didn't really know if there was any wrestling going on there. And then I moved back to Baltimore in the 90s. So I'd always bought magazines. Every couple months I'd pick up a couple magazines or I'd flip on the WWF to see what was going on. But, kind of got out of it for a while. Always on the, like I said, if I'd see a PWI, I'd grab it. I always got the year-end awards for PWI. So I kind of kept my finger on what was going on. Got back into it a little bit around the Attitude Era. Not the garbage stuff that they did. I really love The Rock and Austin and everything. But, now that I'm much older, I'm kind of more interested in the history of wrestling, and learning as much as I can by listening to you guys and Brian and Jim and everything. And just, picking up and reading what I can to learn about, the history of wrestling. So that's kind of where I am now.
All right. Well, I mean, I'm kind of sitting here doing the math too. And you said you were like 12, 13 when you were going to the shows in 86, 87. So obviously you're relying on, dad's transportation.
Yeah.
And then by the time you got, however old, 16, 17, when you could drive, it was a totally different product. And in my opinion, it was nowhere near as good.
No. And at that point, I'm dating my wife and we're going out on the weekends and we're going, on dates and spending time together. And it just never really crossed my mind. And you're right. At that point, Hogan had grown tiresome. You kind of were past the love affair. At least I was with Hogan. The NWA was, Dusty. We had gotten tired of the Dusty finish and everything. And, things were moving along. Like you said, it just, maybe the stuff just wasn't as good in the late 80s, early 90s. At least for me, it kind of lost my attention.
Oh, no. I mean, wrestling went through a really bad period in the early 90s. I was at the Great American Bash in Baltimore in 1991, and they had just fired Ric Flair. And I was beginning to feel my fandom, kind of straining a little bit. I mean, the WWF was what it was. That was losing popularity quickly. Yeah. And the NWA, couldn't figure out what direction it wanted to go in one way or the other. And then the day finally came when, they decided to let go of Ric Flair. His contract was expiring in September anyway, and they let him go at the end of June 1991. And I traveled from Nashua to Baltimore to watch the show, and I attended the show. I attended 3 Great American Bashes in Baltimore, 89, 90, and 91. And 91, it was such a different audience. It was like there's 11,000 people in the building, and they're all angry with the promotion. And they did something smart. The NWA, they had, before the show, they had Gary Michael Capetta get in the ring, and he says, tonight's main event is Barry Windham against Lex Luger, and Ric Flair is no longer with the NWA. And, everyone just started screaming, "We want Flair." Well, guess what? It was smart. The loudest by far "We want Flair" chant was not on their pay-per-view. What's your opinion of Ric Flair? Were you a big fan of his?
As a kid, no, I couldn't stand him.
Good.
He did his job as the heel. I couldn't stand him. I couldn't stand the Horsemen. They're beating up my guy. They're beating up Dusty, attacking him in the parking lot and everything. But no, I've grown to appreciate Flair. But I kind of got a love-hate thing with Flair. To me, the Flair after the accident to, say, 1987 was probably one of the best wrestlers of all time. I think that was peak Flair. Now, don't get me wrong. He had the great run with Steamboat in 89. But, Flair in 85, 86, the way that he carried himself as the NWA champion, looking back on it now, is just phenomenal. But to me, the later years, he had the run in the WWF with the 2 title reigns, and coming back and you look at like his later reigns, some of those to get to 16, some of those reigns were, kind of fluff and whatever. And, you look back now and you do see the similarities in every match with Flair. But, with every wrestler it's that way. You can watch a Bret Hart match, and as good as he was, there was always a certain move set that he stuck to when he was in a match. But some days I like Flair a lot, and some days I'm like, he was okay.
Well, I'm actually glad to hear, first of all, a dissenting opinion on Ric Flair. He's my favorite wrestler of all time, and that doesn't mean he has to be yours.
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I like that. And number 2, you were not a fan of the heels, and I think that's actually kind of cool.
No, I didn't. My father could not stand Cornette. God, he hated Cornette. One of his biggest insults for Cornette when we were at the shows is he called him an ick and airhead. Don't know what that means, but he always called him an ick and airhead and a jackass. So, we didn't like the Midnight Express because, again, they were beating up our boys. They were beating up Ricky and Robert. And, he didn't like the Horsemen. But what's funny is that as you got a little bit older, you kind of appreciated the heels a little bit more. I mean, a guy like Arn Anderson just stuck out.
Yeah.
And I hated Tully. Oh, I hated Tully. But now I go back and I look at Tully and I'm like, God, he was good. So good at what he did.
He really was.
Yeah. And it's like you watch, I didn't mean to cut you off, but you watch Starrcade 87, the match where everybody's upset that the Road Warriors didn't beat them for the belts. But just watching Tully and Arn bounce around for those guys and their body language and the faces that they're making, everything, they were just so good. So good. Of course, back then I couldn't stand them. I wanted the Road Warriors to beat them for the belts. But now I look back at them and just in awe that, they basically trained those guys, the Road Warriors and Lex Luger's, on how to work and everything. So you kind of appreciate them more now than when you were a fan and you hated their guts.
Yeah, I mean, I look at some of the stuff that is on WWE Network that, just came out like a year or two ago. Some of the bashes from 1986. And I just find a newfound appreciation for not only Tully Blanchard, who was absolutely awesome, but for J.J. Dillon.
Yeah, J.J., you look at the first War Games, where Dillon got hurt. They separated it. I think he separated his shoulder when the Road Warriors gave him the clothesline. He was so good. You're right. He could sell in a way that was a bit comical, but not funny. He bled. He knew what to do in the ring. He just, you come to appreciate JJ too. Whole group, the first 4 with Ollie, Arn, Tully, and Flair and JJ, probably one of the best of all time in, a group of wrestlers.
Oh, I completely agree. And it was funny back in the late 80s. The newsletters I don't want to say they didn't like J.J. Dillon, but he was not appreciated enough by that crowd. And I think a lot of it was because, hey, we've decided that Jim Cornette's the best and J.J. is what he is. But I thought he played his role incredibly well as the guy who takes care of these 4 guys, the Four Horsemen.
He could get heat just standing in the back. He would take his glasses off and put the part of his glass in his mouth and, that goes over the ear and just kind of look very just cocky and everything. And you just wanted to smack him. You're like, and he didn't say a word, but then he would come in and he would cut this great promo around 4 guys who were incredible promo guys. And he could hang with them every single week.
No, he played his role extremely well. So you were a fan of the babyfaces. What do you think, what in your opinion was the best match you saw in Baltimore during that 86-87 time frame?
Without a doubt, It was the Road Warriors and Midnight Express, the second night of the Crockett Cup. It was just, the crowd was on fire. You know, you had just had Cornette burn Ronnie Garvin.
Yep.
You know, you wanted to see them get their tails. That, believe it or not, that was the first time I saw Stan in the group in the team, because again, not having cable, I didn't even know that Dennis was gone. You know, they come down the ring. I'm saying to my dad, I'm like, who's that guy? And they, you know, said it was Stan Lane. And I kind of recognized his name from the magazines being with, you know, the Fabulous Ones. But yeah, that match was just, man, that crowd was on fire that night for that match. And then, of course, the ending when Jim tries to throw the fireball at Animal and the way Animal falls back and then everything. I mean, when they lost that match, I mean, I thought the roof was going to come off the arena. You know, again, the one thing I always like to say from when I was a kid was magic. You know what I mean? You felt it. You just wanted the Road Warriors to beat them up. And unfortunately, you know, they didn't get the chance to go and wrestle Dusty and Nikita, but at least Dusty and Nikita beat the Midnight Express to go on to the final of the Crockett Cup.
There you go.
The other one was the Barry Windham Ric Flair match.
From that same night.
That was the first time, you know, I had seen a match, of course, that long. You know what I mean? I think they went like 40, 50 minutes or something, but that was incredible. Again, the crowd was into it. I think the crowd being into it really builds a card up. You know what I mean? When everybody's just sitting on their hands and it's quiet and everything, it's okay. But when the crowd is on fire, it kind of pumps you up as a fan, and you're really getting into it too. And Flair and Windham were so good at that time. So good.
They definitely were. I mean, it's funny to look back. I mean, Barry Windham spent most of 1986, you know, wrestling for the old Florida promotion that was dying before our eyes. And then he comes to Crockett in like fall, I want to say September, October 86. And you just see how incredible, you know, what a great performer he was. It's like, you know, wow, he was just wasting away.
Absolutely. Barry was one of those guys that just was a natural. You know what I mean? There's things he could do, the way he could sell. He'd always have like those rubber legs and everything when a guy hit him really good. And you know, he complimented Flair. He was a lot like Steamboat. Steamboat and Windham really complimented Flair. And Flair, a lot of times, actually broke from that tradition. I mean, he always got thrown off the top rope and everything, but he could go. I mean, the three of those guys going in the 80s, it was good stuff to watch.
Yeah, I remember when Barry Windham first turned heel. I want to say it was March of 1988. I did not see it coming. I did not hear about it, you know, that this was going to happen. Meaning they did a good job keeping it a secret. And I question whether or not Barry Windham would be effective as a heel because he'd never done it before, and he was every bit as good a heel as he was as a babyface, maybe even better.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he was very good as a heel. Even just adding that little black glove, you know what I mean? Just kind of taken from what his father did and everything. Yeah, he really he excelled at being a heel, you know, which sometimes I almost felt like he was a better heel than he was a face at times.
And that's not knocking him as a face. That's saying, wow, he was that good as a heel.
Yeah,
and
he was a great worker.
Yeah, both sides of the fence. And you would think, you know, he grew up in a wrestling family. His dad was a heel, so I mean, I should have figured that out coming in.
Right. It's in the genes.
Exactly. We have a couple of questions I really want to get to. Lawrence Miles asks, who promoted in Baltimore before Capitol Wrestling? I don't know this, John. Do you?
It was Ed Contos. He promoted, I believe, from the 30s up through the 50s or 60s or so. He ran the Coliseum, which was in the city, and he also ran it was called Carlin's Park. It was an amusement park that had, actually, believe it or not, it was the home of the Baltimore Orioles hockey team. That was the amateur team. Yeah. So they ran cards there at Carlin's Park, and then they moved to the Coliseum. And Ed Contos was the promoter down there up until, I want to say, he passed away in the 50s or 60s. I need to check with my buddy, Timothy Johnson. He does a great research on Baltimore history. And I was actually trying to scroll through his Twitter page to find some info. But yeah, it was Ed Contos who was promoting in Baltimore back in the 40s, 50s, heading into the 60s.
All right. Now, here's a question I have. This is from me. obviously at some point the Baltimore was using, Lou Thesz as the NWA champion. You mentioned that they had brought in Carpentier.
Mm-hmm.
When did the WWF take over Baltimore? And if you have any information, like how was it done?
I'm not really sure. I think that it was probably around the late 60s, maybe, when I think that Contos at one point had tried to join the NWA board. And, he was declined. They wouldn't bring him in. But I'm not really sure the transition to when it was basically just WWF wrestlers. I probably would venture to say maybe when they moved to the Civic Center in 62. 62 was when they moved to the Civic Center, and the Coliseum they stopped using around that time.
Okay.
So maybe around the time that Rogers had won the title and Contos had passed away, maybe that was when Vince Sr. had somebody else come in and start running Baltimore and being a little bit more WWF instead of bringing guys from all over the country. Because at point you had Vern Gagne coming in wrestling as the U.S. champion. Like I said, Giant Baba coming into wrestle in Baltimore. So maybe it was the early 60s. I could look it up, maybe put it on the Stick to Wrestling Facebook page.
That would be
I could talk to Timothy and see what I can find out.
That would be fantastic. Now, Let me ask you this. I have an idea, but how far in terms of time traveled is Baltimore from Washington, D.C.?
Probably about 40 minutes.
Okay, was about my experience. Let me ask you this. Like, what was it like having two major towns so close to each other, either back in like the 50s or 60s, coming into the WWF days?
I don't know. It's kind of hard for me to answer because I'm not really sure what it was like back then. I'm kind of stuck in that little box of what was going on with Baltimore, not really sure what was going on in DC and, from Philly and things like that. I mean, I know that there were promotions across the state of Maryland, but not really, sure as to that transition from the WWF over. I mean, because you got to figure in the early 80s, even Ole came up with Georgia Championship Wrestling and ran some cards in the arena.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
And one of them is actually on WWE Network. I recommend it because it has a really good Ric Flair versus Jack Briscoe match on it.
Ooh.
Yeah, and I believe it was the last time Jack wrestled for the NWA title. He would be off to the WWF pretty soon. As a matter of fact, his career was kind of winding down anyway. But yeah, I mean, someone might say to me, well, Boston and Providence are really close to each other. How did that work? And it's just Providence wasn't as big a city as either Baltimore or Washington, so Providence really didn't get much. They don't have any major league sports there, so it was all kind of centered around Boston.
Yeah, and if going back through the Cornette Midnight Express scrapbook, seemed like it was like towards the 80s. It was kind of few and far between to do DC shows. There was the Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland, that was used for shows. That was kind of closer to DC. There was I can't remember the name of the venue, but there was something in DC that McMahon ran when Contos was running the Coliseum in Baltimore. But, it's funny. When I found out that Jake Roberts and Ronnie Garvin had wrestled for the TV title for Georgia Championship Wrestling, I got the magazine. I think it was Inside Wrestling. And I'm like, I'm going to a convention and the Snake's going to be there and Garvin's going to be there. Boy, that was a trip because Jake Roberts was running around fooling with Tony Atlas, so I could barely get his signature on the thing. And then I go and I meet Ronnie Garvin, and Ronnie Garvin starts like throwing out political propaganda. And I'm like, my God, all I want to do is get your autograph. I don't even know your political standings. He talked me out for like 10 minutes. I'm like, okay, you're not going to sway me to whatever you're believing. And then he started talking bad about Dusty, and I'm like, all right, that's enough. That's enough.
Oh, wow. How long ago was this?
This was 2017. This was in Jersey. It was actually the first time I met Cornette. It was something Champions, or I can't remember what it was, but it was a thing in Jersey in 2017.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, well, and Ronnie Garvin just comes out without provocation and starts talking bad about Dusty Rhodes. That's great.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he went from, like I said, talking politics to how crappy of a, booker Dusty was, and he always put himself in the main events and always this and that and the other. And, I let him talk for a couple minutes and I'm like, all right, I got to go, so I almost had to break away from him and stop him from talking and walk away instead of me running my mouth.
Usually it's the opposite with the wrestlers. That's pretty funny.
Exactly.
I mean, people are, I met Ronnie Garvin multiple times. He was a really good guy, but I mean, he wasn't there to talk shop with some dude in his early 20s.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So that was a hoot.
All right. Well, anyway, I have a question from our pal Mike Fahey, who is also from Baltimore, or at least he's from the Baltimore area. I know he's a big Maryland Terrapins fan. John, I know you went to some shows at the arena in Baltimore, which I did. I actually went to another show in 87 beyond like the bashes. That was, what was it, Labor Day weekend. And he said the thought on the crowd in comparison to the Boston Garden. And I've always said this, there is some line between Baltimore and Philadelphia where like people in New York and Boston and Philly, I mean, I'm sorry, there's no other word. Like, we're a bunch of assholes. We know it. It's cold. And somewhere down the line, there's like a line, because I went to a baseball game in Baltimore, an Orioles game in 88. And John, I don't know if you remember, the Orioles were like historically bad that season.
Would they start out 0-21 or 0-22 or something?
Something like that, yeah. And
bad.
it didn't get much better. I go to the game and I'm waiting for the fine people of Baltimore to start savaging Fred Lynn and Eddie Murray and everyone else, because that's what would happen in Boston. I'm telling you right now, it would happen in New York and Philly too. And the fans were just so polite to these guys. They were actually nice. They were cheering them and, rooting them on. I was just taken aback by the experience. And to answer Mike's question, I thought it was a lot less crazy in Baltimore. There was heat. I'm not saying there wasn't. There was just something that in the water in Boston. I mean, until the mid-'70s, they had this netting around the ring because people were throwing heavy things at the wrestlers. We talked about Blackjack Mulligan getting stabbed in Boston. It was just, something about wrestling night and hockey night in Boston just made everyone crazy. Things were a lot more civilized at the Celtics and Red Sox games, but not saying those weren't crazy either. But yeah, so I would say the crowds in Boston were a lot wilder, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, I've talked about, when my friends and I would go in like 81, 82, 83, you didn't wear anything that made you stand out from the crowd. Like, don't wear, a Patriots t-shirt or anything like that, because someone will start yelling at you about they don't like the Patriots, or they performed poorly or whatever else. But anyway, so what was your favorite show that you ever went to? Did you get to go to one of the Great American Bashes?
I did not, believe it or not. Being in Baltimore, the stretch that they had with the Bashes, no, never got to go one. So again, for me, everything always goes back to the Crockett Cup. So the second night of the Crockett Cup was pretty incredible. I mean, the first night was great. Ole pile driving Bubba Rogers in a cage was pretty cool. But the second night of the Crockett Cup is the one that stands out for me the most. Dusty coming off the top with a cross body block on Tully Blanchard, who's about to pile drive Nikita Koloff, who had the bad neck.
Yep.
That was great stuff. Great stuff. But you were talking about Philly. I don't mean to change subjects, but
no, go ahead.
Emmett Smith one time says, they call Philly the city of brotherly love. He's like, you go to Philly, you get no love in Philly. So any team that comes into Philadelphia catches some slack for not being, from Philly, especially a Cowboy.
Oh, yeah.
But going back to the wrestling thing, it was the second night of the Crockett Cup. That was without a doubt my favorite night as a kid.
Now, when the finals happen, you've got Tully Blanchard, one of the top guys in the promotion, obviously, and you've got this shiny new Lex Luger guy who obviously was getting the giant push right from the start. They're in the finals against Dusty and Nikita. Like, even when you were that age, did you first of all, let me ask you this. You kind of knew this wasn't like a legit sporting event, right? I'm guessing?
Yes. There were parts that you kind of thought was real, and then there were parts that you figured that wasn't. One of the things that stands out the most to me was when I got my first wrestling video that my dad bought for me, or my parents bought for me, was Bash 86. And, and then that was great. But Bash 87, it was the War Games videotape. And there is basically a shot where Animal gets thrown into the cage and he's down on his belly, and you see his hands up by his forehead, and then his hands go down to his trunks. And it looks like he's putting something in his trunks. And for years, my mom used to say to me, oh, they cut themselves with razor blades and everything. I didn't believe her. I saw that. I was like, man, they do cut themselves with razor blades. So Yeah, at that point, we kind of figured, some of it was real and some of it was not real. So, but yeah, there was still a little bit of mystique. They still made you believe, but then you could see that punches weren't landing most of the time.
Yeah. So my second part of that question then, like when they had that final, like, did you automatically say, okay, Dusty and Nikita are definitely winning this thing, or did you have a question mark?
No, I knew Dusty and Nikita were going to win, especially after McAdam walking down to the ring.
Oh, that's right.
There's no way you're going to have Dusty and Nikita lose with McAdam walking down to the ring for the first time since his accident.
Yeah, I mean, my friends and I, when we would go to Boston, like the rule was, okay, turn off your brain and pretend that it's real. Just, take it like it's a movie. Yeah. But sometimes you just couldn't do that, I mean, you knew Killer Khan wasn't beating Bob Backlund in Boston.
But, even with WrestleMania 3, I said before that I was nervous because, I wasn't sure. But there was kind of a part that was thinking, they were building Andre up as being undefeated and everything, and he was this monster and whatnot. But I kind of had a feeling he wasn't going to beat Hogan. And then I think what shocked me, too, was the main event when they did the Twin Hebners and Andre took the belt from Hogan. But heading into WrestleMania 4, I knew that Savage was going to win the title. There was no way that DiBiase was going to win the belt. But that was probably around the time that things kind of almost became obvious, that things were going to happen. I mean, even with Steamboat coming in and beating Flair, that wasn't super, surprising. He just comes out of nowhere. You figure they're going to do something, to change things up a little bit. But no, it was probably, that's when you saw behind the curtain a little bit and saw through the smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, the same for me. I will be honest with you. When they were building up the Andre the Giant versus Hulk Hogan match, they did something that I thought was spectacular. One of the greatest swerves ever. And that is they go on, I think it was Piper's Pit. They show the ultimate, the giant belt that they had to make special made for Andre. Yeah. I think the average person who even, they know wrestling's not in the legitimate or, they know it's booked. And I said to myself, wait a minute, why would they go out and have this belt made if Andre wasn't going to win? Right. And I kind of figured, okay, maybe Andre will win the title, hold it. And I had no idea Andre was having health problems. I had literally just started getting the Observer like 2 months ago, and it hadn't all soaked in yet. And I'm like, what if they just have Andre have the title for a year? We have Hogan win it back at the next WrestleMania, or maybe, I don't know when, but they did a good job, to me with that, making us wonder, okay, who's going to win this thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, they didn't spend a lot of time building that up. I mean, they used Piper's Pit really well to build it up. You know what I mean? Hogan coming out and Andre comes out and rips the cross off of his chest and everything and and then he came back the next week and said he was going to take the challenge. He did, So, yeah, it wasn't a lot to build it up, but, man, it created a lot of drama, just for that one match. And you had Hogan, who was a superhero, and you had Andre built up as the ultimate undefeated guy. So, it was pretty great. It was a great time to be a wrestling fan.
It was. That was, whether or not Andre could work, it didn't matter to the average person. I mean, that was the match. That was the biggest match of my lifetime. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. It was kind of the peak for me. Like I said, from 85 to, the late 88 or whatever, but 87, that build up for WrestleMania 3 was just, that was like I said, I had a feeling Hogan was going to win, but I really wasn't sure. I was, my father brought the newspaper home the next day. I still have the article that I clipped out of Hogan beating Andre.
The funny thing is, when you look back at WrestleMania 3, that was the first WWF show that had absolutely no fat. It was all steak. Even WrestleMania 2, you had like Jake Roberts against George Wells, etc.
Yeah.
Matches that you knew, that's a squash match. I mean, WrestleMania 3, they didn't need any kind of an undercard. Hogan Andre was going to sell the whole thing. But when you open up with the Can-Am Connection, who was getting a rocket push at that time against Morocco and Orton in the opener, I just said to myself, oh, my God, this is going to be just an amazing afternoon, and it was.
Yeah, and it had a little bit for everybody. You go with Hillbilly Jim and a Haiti Kid and Little Beaver against King Kong Bundy, Little Tokyo, and Little Lord Littlebrook. You know what I mean? So you had that for the kids too. The kids could see the little people wrestlers, or I didn't know if midget would be,
they call them
nowadays.
If they call them midgets, I'll call them midgets.
Exactly. Harley and Junkyard Dog, Valentine and Beefcake. Wasn't that when? Yeah, and then of course Piper and Adonis. How can you go wrong with Adonis getting his head shaved? Of course, they didn't do it as good as they did in the NWA, but they shaved his head.
I mean, the next week he came on TV with a completely shaved head. Poor Adrian, he gets fired like 3 weeks later.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't know if you heard the story. Like they were constantly I don't want to say at war, but there was constant friction between Adrian and the office because it was too much to ask for him to look respectable on an airplane. They wanted the wrestlers to wear, just wear. I think they had to wear, I don't know, they didn't have to wear a suit or a tie or anything like that. It was just, just look respectable. And Adrian would roll out of bed in his sweatpants and get on an airplane and representing the WWF. So after so many years of that, they're like, okay, let's shave his head and get rid of him.
I didn't know that. You think that's the reason why they gave him the gimmick that they did? To kind of try to push him out or embarrass him?
You know what? That's kind of a Vince loved that gimmick. And when you look back at 86, Adrian Adonis got so much of a push and so much TV time, yet there was always a problem of some sort with Adrian Adonis. He got suspended in the summer of 86, right before he was supposed to do a big program with Piper. And then he comes back, and I thought the program with Piper was kind of, I don't know. I thought it was beneath Piper, to be honest with you. And I'm an Adrian Adonis fan. Yeah,
I mean, Piper at that point, it was almost rivaling Hogan for popularity when he switched over from heel, because he was such an effective heel. So when he changed, he was pretty hot there for a while. But yeah, kind of him beating Adonis at WrestleMania 3 really isn't, that big of a deal. It's not as great as the match he had with Bret Hart at WrestleMania for the Intercontinental title.
No, that was an outstanding match. So you were still watching in like 92 when that match happened. Were you still following it regularly, or just kind of every now and then?
Every now and then, I would get a little interested around WrestleMania. And then, like I said, I was constantly picking up the wrestling magazines. So if I saw something on a cover, and like I said, I always got the year-end awards, and I always tried to get the Super Cards issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. So yeah, it was just a matter of, if I saw something that that kind of piqued my interest, I picked up the magazine and will turn on, even my dad to this day. I mean, being a fan going back to the 50s and 60s, he'll occasionally turn on Raw and see what's going on, or he'll turn on SmackDown. That's cool. I do the same thing. I'll just turn it on just to see. Or, one of the things that I do now is after a pay-per-view, I'll go online and look at the results and, see what's going on. Because there's still some guys that I could follow or seem to like in wrestling today.
It's funny. We had some wrestling talk over Thanksgiving, and I was asked, do I still watch? And I do. I watch the monthly events, and they still call them pay-per-views, so I might as well, on WWE Network. But other than that, I just can't do Raw, SmackDown every week. I'm glad your dad can get into it occasionally a little bit.
I don't remember the last time I watched the full wrestling show.
It's different.
Yeah, it is different. And it's tough now, even with COVID going on and no crowds being there. And even though they have the screens and, the little everybody on the screens, it's different, And
yeah.
It's too much. I don't want to sound like a Cornette clone, but it's too much of an exhibition now. There's not a lot that makes you suspend disbelief. I mean, I know, like they always say, the horse has left the barn. You can never go back to kayfabe. But it is difficult to watch them kind of go through a routine and things like that, and constantly reading people saying, well, the work rate was this and this, that, and the other. And it's kind of like back when we watched it and we were really into it, the guy made a mistake, he made a mistake. It's not like you said, oh, well, he fumbled this or whatever. It kind of still looked like a match. It still looked like they were fighting for something. Nowadays, it doesn't look like that. So
it doesn't. It's funny you mentioned the magazines. I mean, I was crazy with the wrestling magazines when I was a kid. There was a time when I literally, not only did I buy everything that I saw at the store, I literally had purchased every back issue of the After magazines that were available. Like I would
Did
go
you
through,
really?
yeah, I would go through the wrestling magazines. Okay, what back issue can I buy? And I already had all of them. I was insane. And then when I started getting the Observer started getting it late 86, very end of 86, like the After magazines almost immediately became obsolete to me. And that, in a way, it was kind of sad because, I had grown up with those. I had been buying them for literally exactly 10 and a half years. And out of some bizarre loyalty, I kept buying Inside Wrestling, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and The Wrestler every single month. And it wasn't even a New Year's resolution. It was like a new decade resolution. I said to myself in 89, starting in 1990, I'm not doing this anymore. I am only, as you did, well, not only for you, but only for me, I only bought the year-end awards issue. And even then, by the time the 90s were over, I was kind of done doing that.
And I know that, what you're saying, like the magazines kind of losing, kind of like their validity once you start reading the Observer. But like for me, the year-end awards was always something to look forward to. And through the power of eBay, I've been able to go back and get every award issue in the lineage of the Pro Wrestling Illustrated. I have from 1972 up through this last year when Adam Cole won Wrestler of the Year.
Wow.
So I have the 72. It's the cover where Bruno won the Battle Royal in Los Angeles.
Yep.
So I have that going up through this year. So yeah, those are my babies. I like those.
Okay. No, I remember back in the day, like the magazines, the After magazines would switch. Like one year, the awards would be like in The Wrestler. Then one year it would be in like Sports Review Wrestling. And then in the 80s, it almost felt like Bill Apter said, okay, this Pro Wrestling Illustrated thing is going to be the magazine. And it had a great sounding title. Yeah. And they had color pictures and everything, which was, made them very different. So, I mean, what I'm saying in a long-winded way, it was kind of nice to know where the year-end awards were going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you knew around, like February or so that the issue was going to come out. So you started looking for it in the, your local grocery store or, like a Rite Aid or something like that. But yeah. But it's pretty sad when you find out that Lou Brock is not a real person. You know what I mean? That guy you remember Lou Brock from the wrestling magazines? He was supposed to be the cigar smoking, old stogie wrestling writer. Do you remember him?
I remember Lou Brock from the St. Louis Cardinals. I also remember Matt Brock from the wrestling magazine.
It's Matt Brock. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That was great. Yeah, I mean, I do remember that. And I remember as a kid, thinking, okay, this guy is flying around the country for no apparent reason so he can write a paragraph about whatever city he had just been in. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, but, I figured he was a real person. Like, no, he was a figment of Bill Apter's imagination. Exactly. And I was too old to be taken aback by this information. I really was. I learned that in 87 when I was 21 years old. That, they made stuff up sometimes in the After magazines.
And thank you for correcting my Lou Brock, Matt Brock. And I'm sitting here with a Pro Wrestling Illustrated in front of me, and I still got it wrong. So
no sweat. I mean, you know what? Our buddy Tyler Judd, he put it the best. I mean, when you're out here doing a podcast, the bullets are flying. You don't always have time to think about. No, not Lou Brock. Hey, here's a question I wanted to get in from Christian Body. We're almost done. This hour flies by. Was Baltimore Crockett's best northern city even over Philadelphia? Do you have an opinion on this?
Are we talking drawing money-wise or how they out or whatever? Because
I'll tell you what. Let's do both.
Okay. I actually, again, I apologize. I saw that you had asked for questions, and that one kind of intrigued me. So like I said, I grabbed Cornette's Midnight Express scrapbook. And so say May of 86, the show that I went to the first time in Baltimore, it was a $75,000 house. Philly that same month drew $55,000. And then for a non-bash event in July of 86, Baltimore drew $106,000. But that was the Veteran Stadium show for the first bash, and that was a $215,000 house. So, it kind of almost bounced back and forth. Baltimore would do, here's a great one. In October of 86, the same day, that they were in Philly and Baltimore. I'm sorry, 1286. Baltimore was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They did $107,000. Philly at 8 p.m. did $110,000. So $217,000 in two cities in one day in late 86 for Crockett.
You know, it's funny. I went to a show in Baltimore in September 1987, and I took a trip. I visited my wrestling buddies down there, and I get a call once I get into town, and my friend's like, hey, let's not go to the Philly show. Let's go to the Baltimore show. And he reads me the card, and I'm like, wow, yeah, sure. If you guys are willing to drive down there, I'm in. And yeah, so they had the same night using the same guys in Baltimore and Philly. And I'm working really hard to get this up. I'm trying to find it. Let me see. September.
Was it September of 87?
September 5th, 1987. They ran both shows on the same night. Philly drew 3,200. Wow. And Baltimore did 9,000. And I remember like Ric Flair and the Horsemen, they went on early in Philly. They drove up or they flew up. I don't know what they did. And they wrestled again that same night. It wasn't a matinee, the same night in Baltimore. And as a result in Baltimore, and maybe you remember this, they had Nikita Koloff against Lex Luger in a 2 out of 3 fall match that went 42 minutes.
Oh.
Now, were you at this show?
No, I wasn't. Thank goodness.
Yeah. And I remember the match. This is Nikita, who was never that good, and Lex Luger when he was first breaking in, and they're relying on these two, just to keep the show going until the Horsemen arrive. And I'm sure everyone was greatly relieved when they got that signal. Yeah, Nikita and Luger was just unbelievably bad. I'm sorry you missed it.
Oh, and what's terrible too is this was the less roided up, babyface Nikita Koloff. So that was even worse. When he was juiced and he was the monster, at least it was like, wow, this guy looks like, an action figure. But once he lost his muscle definition, it's still not as bad as when he grew his hair out. But
you beat me to it.
It's like looking at this. It reminds me, I saw Nikita at a WrestleCade a couple years ago. And he told me that they were wrestling in Virginia and they had to wrestle in Baltimore that night. And there was something going on. They were running late. They actually had Nikita and Flair go on in the middle of the card so they could make it up to Baltimore for that night's show. And they went on, according to him, they went on kind of late. So they just had to move things around to get them from one area to another. So at least he didn't have to go 40 minutes with Lex Luger to keep everybody happy until Flair got there.
I mean, I vaguely remember the match. There's no film of it. And it's from 33 years ago. But I mean, I remember just being like, oh my God, this is awful. They didn't have 42 minutes of stuff to get in the match.
I know. Can you imagine? Oh my God, I can't even think about it.
I can only imagine what it was like growing up in an NWA city. Like, God help us if I had grown up in Baltimore, because I would have gone to the shows in Philly. I would have gone to the shows in Washington and all points in between. Mm-hmm. I'm glad I didn't burn all my money up like that.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, John, we are out of time. This is an excellent show. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing your wealth of information.
No, I appreciate the time. I mean, I'm glad that you told me Lou Brock was a baseball player instead of a magazine writer. But other than that, I had a great time.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. We will definitely do this again. I want to thank Lightning Lou Kipilman, our producer. By the way, I want to really thank him for last week's show, because it went over 2 hours and he had to splice together like the Ole and Dave interview and me and Thomas, talking about it. I'm sure that was a challenge. I want to publicly thank him and thank everyone for listening. This has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. So long from the Granite State.
This concludes our podcast day.